join. Just encourage everyone to put their name in the chat and institution, but I'll let Angela introduce first.
Hey everybody, good morning. Esther, thanks again for being here. We appreciate it. I know it's the holidays, and so we're so excited for Helen to be able to provide this last training session for us. This is going to be part 2 of the Prepare series. We had part 1 yesterday. Thank you, Tessa. And so afterward, we'll be sending out the compiled recordings of yesterday and today with both of the slide decks as well, with resources. So both of those will be emailed out later this afternoon. And with that, I will turn it over to Helen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Angela. And hello, everyone. My name is Helen Wiley. I'm SBP's Disaster Preparedness Program Director. If you're not familiar with SBP, SBP is a national nonprofit organization devoted to shrinking the time between disasters and recovery. And our Prepare program is one of our 5 interventions. And we partner often with SHARE, which Angela runs on delivering different types of resources. Specifically in our preparedness program, we really aim to better equip not only households, but all the stakeholders and communities with better knowledge and capacity to make informed disaster preparedness decisions. And you can learn more about our current programs and initiatives on our website. Additionally, we have a lot of really great resources that you can take advantage of. So again, we'd encourage you to go to our website to find those, and we'll share links in the chat. So to really get into the content, we're going to be talking today about what disaster resilience means. And, for those that are less familiar with this terminology, we really wanted to pose this today as building disaster safe communities, but we are going to launch into what disaster resilience specifically means. And not spend too much time there defining, but then really get into examples of what this looks like in different phases of the disaster cycle, not only in the ways in which other organizations and entities approach this around the country, but ways we do so as well, and would encourage participants to share their own examples and questions as we go through the presentation. The other thing is we are raffling a gift certificate to folks that fill out our survey following this presentation. We really rely in the Prepare program on getting feedback from those that attend our trainings to better understand what information is most helpful as we continue to evolve our curriculum and content. So thank you in advance for doing that. Okay, so we're going to start with defining disaster resilience. So, we're a small crowd here, but want everyone to just reflect on what characteristics would you associate with a more disaster resilient or disaster safe community. And we're a really small group, so I really don't want to have to put people on the spot. But Esther, if there's anything that comes to mind, that would be great. And then I'll ask my colleagues to also share an idea.
Hey, I'm good with a one-woman show. Okay, so, or in this case, 4. Resilient. I think, well, there's a lot of definitions and how it could be, but for communities, I think just having that support is like key to resiliency. From the few disasters I've been involved with so far, that support system that's readily put into place.
Yeah, no, I would think of that as kind of, the capacity, like what are kind of, each different entities having as a role to create that support. Any thoughts from Angela or Tessa?
I feel like I go with infrastructure for some reason, of like, is the community prepared with their like roads and water removal and like all of that? That's, for some reason, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, Tessa?
Yeah, if you guys can hear me okay, on my end, mine automatically jumps to financial preparedness.
That makes sense.
Being a key part of that. Yep.
Well, so I think the key thing here really is when we think about community level disaster resilience, and this is a graphic from a publication a few years back, there's all these different layers and types of activities. And so each of the things you mentioned, would fit into different aspects of this. And so, social cohesiveness, engagement, like a number of these different things I think go into, again, like how do we create, the level of engagement and infrastructure locally for folks to work together. But the way we think about defining disaster resilience at SBP is households and communities that are able to anticipate, prepare, absorb, recover, and thrive when presented with environmental change and natural hazards. And I think, definitions are only so important, but importantly here is we really think about disaster resilience extending across the full disaster cycle, and that it's really key to be able to incorporate each of these different pieces of the puzzle in order to ultimately build towards greater disaster resilience. And so as part of that, this is an analogy we really like using, that building a more disaster resilient really requires having complementary layers of activities. So if you think about it like Swiss cheese, one layer of activity like investing more heavily in infrastructure locally to be reduce risks and mitigate that risk for the next disaster event. That's just one layer of how to be more resilient. And so another layer, like building financial resilience, as Tessa was mentioning, where you're enabling more folks to have insurance or grant programs that get resources out to folks more quickly. That's another layer that then covers over some of the first holes in that other layer. And so taking this approach, we can't do everything at once, but the more activities we layer on to one another at the local and state and federal levels, the more resilient our communities will be able to be. And so again, a final kind of graphic here is, the real goal, of course, is we want communities and individuals to be able to recover more quickly when a disaster occurs. And so here you can see that, a community that has more levels and layers of disaster resilient building activities is typically able to recover more quickly and ultimately be stronger as they then, prepare for the unfortunate reality that they'll potentially have future disaster events as well. And as we know, again, quicker recoveries are really critical for being able to lessen the impacts on our most vulnerable households. The other thing that's important, as I'll then share different examples across the disaster cycle, is, no community is the same as another. And so thinking about what strategies work in more urban versus rural contexts, what works depending on the population makeup. Are there a lot of immigrants? Is there a especially high percentage of older adults? What language barriers are there? Are there a higher number of folks with disabilities? It's all really important as you think about what activities are most important to prioritize. And then finally here that, just want to emphasize again how important communication and coordination is across all levels. We can't build more disaster resilient or disaster safe communities unless we're thinking about measures at the household, but also the community, the state, and the federal level, and how to better promote communication across all of those to achieve our goals. So with that, we're going to start putting this more into context. So just to recap, there's 5 different categories we think about here across the cycle. So anticipating, preparing for, absorbing, recovering, and ultimately seeking to thrive, which is, of course, the hardest thing in the disaster sense. So going into anticipating disasters, we really believe that at SBP that using data is critical as we seek to, anticipate what disaster challenges might be. And so understanding in a particular area, what are the social vulnerabilities? What does the data show in terms of, percentage makeup of folks over 65 and these different categories I was describing before. And so one tool that we really encourage people to use is the Social Vulnerability Index. We use it to drive our work at SBP. And what it is a tool that is led by researchers out of the University of South Carolina, and the index really helps practitioners to measure the vulnerability of different U.S. counties to the various different types of natural hazards. And so then what it'll show is, areas where there's less capacity across the 29 socioeconomic variables that are used in the index. And so it's a really great tool, and you can go on their website to learn more about it. The other thing that we mention in all of our presentations in the preparedness program at SBP is using riskfactor.com. So, we were just with Sovi talking about more of a governmental or nonprofit based tool. But, when we think about anticipating disasters as practitioners, we really need to be encouraging households to better understand their individual levels of risk. And so we really guide folks to use riskfactor.com. It is a tool created by the First Street Foundation, which is a nonprofit that creates scores from 1 to 10 across flood, wildfire, heat, and wind for households to put in either their zip code or their address and get the score for each of those different hazards to better understand what the risk level is. And then the tool also shares different suggestions from a mitigation standpoint of things that folks might want to pursue. And, I think, again, depending on where you work as a practitioner, what type of nonprofit you're in, how heavily involved you are in local planning, what we really want to do using these different data sources is to incorporate what the data tells us about risks and what populations are most vulnerable into thinking about what planning activities are most important for the next disaster event, because we really want to lessen the impact. And then again, going back to, this overarching goal of building a more disaster resilient community, ultimately save money. So again, we can allocate resources to more folks because we're being efficient in the recovery process, but ultimately also really speed the recovery to lessen the suffering of individuals. And so some questions to think about within your own organizations, but also, the other entities locally that you work with is, what does the data tell you in terms of where you can best invest? And, what impacts are most important to address? What projects, would do the best job of lowering risk and are good investments? And we'll share some examples in some of the other sections here. And then, who's going to do the work? Which organizations locally have the capacity to take on these activities to lower risk or better inform individuals? And, who needs to be trained in order to pursue various activities locally? And then the final thing here, and we think about anticipating, and although of course there's so many other examples, but FEMA has what are called the FEMA community lifelines. And these are these categories of, fundamental community services that enable all other aspects of a community to function. And so have a few different resources listed here that we can link in the chat or send out after this presentation, that bring you to their toolkit guides. But again, thinking about these critical things of, safety and security, what are the health and medical services that need to be able to function in a disaster event? What are the communication and transportation functions that need to work, particularly for those that might be, isolated at home? And so again, knowing again that there's good resources across the country to help inform what we're doing at our local level. So I'm going to go through some ideas here for preparing for disasters, and then I'm going to pause for any questions. So please, start thinking about if there are any questions or examples you'd want to share from your own work of, how you work to anticipate and prepare for disasters. So an example here, when we think about preparing for disasters, and this really needs to extend from, again, how we're just thinking about anticipating and using data. But one really good thing for local areas to be doing is putting disaster registries in place. And so one example we have here is, after really devastating floods in the 90s in Southern Oregon, the local council of governments in one area developed a disaster registry for older adults and folks with disability and caretakers to really enable people locally to understand and the emergency responders to know who would be most vulnerable and need to be checked on first. And so disaster registries are in place in most parts of the country, but it's really important to be guiding folks during these non-disaster periods towards registering there, in local registries so that they are able to be assisted should a disaster occur. And then, Tessa shared earlier, this is an example of, one way to think about disaster resilience, but at SBP, something that we really think of as a critical layer of better preparing communities is seeking to prepare folks financially for disaster events. And so we think about there being 5 key action areas that we need households to take as they seek to be better prepared. But underlying in this is ultimately, thinking through financially having the tools and resources available. And we do a lot of presentations specifically on this whole topic area, so I won't go too much in depth. But want you as practitioners to be thinking about that. When we think about the importance of purchasing flood insurance and how to enable greater affordability for flood insurance at the household level, that's very connected to these other categories of how we want households to be making recovery plans in advance. And so, when we think about household disaster planning, we actually believe it should really start with creating this recovery plan for what you would do should a disaster occur. And so going through, what is the best option at the household level for, having savings versus accessing credit or loans, knowing if you'd qualify for disaster aid at the federal level, and then what are your options to get more affordable disaster insurance coverage. But you start there, and then these other aspects that folks are more familiar with of, making your emergency plan and building a disaster supply kit are absolutely critical as well. But, we need to be thinking about recovery planning in order to prepare households for future events. And so we have different types of questions that we seek at least to guide households through and those that work with them as they seek to rebudget to prepare financially. We also have a lot of great resources on our website as we think about, again, from an insurance standpoint in particular, since we believe it's the most important financial tool that can aid folks in their recovery in terms of really working through these tough challenges for making insurance more affordable. So I just shared a few different examples very quickly, but wanted to pause here in case anyone has any questions about, how to anticipate and prepare for disasters, but would also love if anyone wants to share examples of programs or activities you do in your communities kind of for these phases of disasters. And please don't be shy.
Juanisa or Mike, I know you guys were on yesterday as well. Love to hear from you if you have thoughts.
Hey team, it's Mike here. For me, it's all about having a plan, right? Who within your catchment area you could reach out to, family, friends, agencies, etc. Because again, during these darkest times, you have to really figure out what's your next step, right? I'm well aware that, I'm part of a team called Team Rubicon. I know when we do disaster relief work, it's like, what do you have in your home that's the most valuable? Is it your paperwork, your driver's license, insurance paperwork, etc. So to me is before the mitigation, really finding out what is your active plan. So that's what I would suggest. So thanks.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense, Mike. I think, what we try and presentations specifically on preparing to do is help households in particular understand that, you need to be prepared as an individual and, really rely on your neighbor network and folks of how, pre-plan how you would support one another, because emergency services needs to be able to focus on those that are absolutely most vulnerable. So again, the elderly or disabled in particular. And so again, thinking through your individual plan is really important. Any other comments or questions?
This is Esther. I know in one of the smaller rural communities, the community itself is not anticipating that they will have another one, but in anticipation of another one, working to gather the resources to build a community shelter. And that's really important in our rural areas where a lot of people do not have the capacity to drive or public transportation to get you to a larger city where there is shelters that are generally built with grants and such.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I increasingly hear examples, for instance, of I think you're talking about shelters for people to physically go. And we'll talk about resilience hubs in a minute. But I've also heard some good examples of, rural areas pre-purchasing tarps, for instance, to put in strategic locations, given geographically it being harder to, get resources out or in very quickly post-disaster. And so, kind of pre-planning of where resources need to be housed, or again, particularly from a sheltering perspective of what are the best locations to be guiding people towards, from just accessibility challenges and also more spread out population areas. Well, great. I'm going to keep going, but please feel free to put additional questions or comments in the chat. And so I think, importantly here, all these different examples I'm giving, they blur a bit across the different categories. But, now we're going to talk a little bit about ways to absorb disaster shocks. And so that really, this pre-planning and anticipating and preparing for disasters really leads into then how are we trying to absorb disaster shocks when they occur. So, I think as an entry point here, an example is, for example, having safe rooms or, shelters, as you were just sharing, Esther, where people can plan to go depending on the disaster type and whether their home would be a safe place or not. And so, Joplin, in Missouri, about a little over a decade now ago, had a really deadly tornado. And after that event, they invested particularly in the school district to build safe rooms to shelter both students, but also community members for future tornado events that would be located, closest to those tornado safe rooms, which had been strategically located in different schools. And so, really important way, first and foremost, communities to be thinking about reducing the loss of life and injuries, but, learning from events as we then seek to invest for future preparedness and other ones. And so, should anything ever occur in that area again, hopefully having these physical locations where people are being instructed to go that are made in ways that are physically resistant will help, prevent that loss of life. And so another example here that this is really rising across the country. Resilience hubs are becoming very common, and there's a lot of investment in them in different locations, but there's several different ways resilience hubs can function. But, generally the idea is they are locations somewhere in a community that can provide support for residents, maybe seek to increase community capacity in non-disaster periods for when a disaster occurs. But, so one, you'll have examples now of libraries or community centers that are, being the places now where resources are being restored, or the planning is such that they be, the service distribution centers when an event occurs. So being staging areas, also being the places, particularly if folks are using library systems, that information is available on how to prepare for a disaster event, or, where information on how to do FEMA appeals, or, apply for FEMA aid, that's where all the information would be housed for folks and distributed. So one example here of resilience hubs is, for example, the city of Orlando got a grant, to take 6 existing community centers and make them into these resilience hubs to help, create that capacity and coordination and how the city would respond and recover from disaster events. And so being, the physical location where residents could plan to charge their phones and access Wi-Fi, because there were generators and power sources in place to enable continued energy and power, but also, be that place then for folks to plan on how they can get in contact with folks outside of the community, given that, if cell phone networks, et cetera, are down, it's much more challenging to communicate. So I'd really encourage everyone, to just learn more about resilience hubs and the ways they're kind of coming about in different parts of the country. And there's increasingly more grant opportunities in place that are helping to encourage the creation of these types of resource centers. And then an example at SBP of how we think about absorbing shocks is creating, and rebuilding homes to higher resilience standards. So, again, it's just so important that we are putting survivors back in homes that will help them better withstand disasters should another one occur in their community. And so examples of how we do that at SBP is putting measures in place like vinyl plank flooring, or tiling rather than carpeting, of things that are easy to clean, and get people back in their homes faster should they be flooded again. And then most importantly, we really try to put fortified roofs on as many of our rebuilds as possible. The IBHS standard for, roofs is really designed to withstand high-powered winds from hurricanes or tornadoes. And keeping a roof on a home is one of the most important ways to prevent further damage to it. And so those are 2 things that we think about and really encourage partners, particularly in the rebuilding space, to be thinking about, how to make homes more resilient and able to withstand disaster shocks. So then a couple examples here of, how we think about recovering from disasters, another piece of building, again, more disaster resilient communities. And so one example that, we think is very powerful is after Hurricane Harvey in the Houston area, the Hurricane Harvey Relief Fund launched an online home repair system, which was ultimately called Harvey Home Connect. And this system, could use data to match eligible homeowners with, the right nonprofits that could provide home repair services, and really be this connective tool to get what the resources available were to homeowners in different areas. And having these types of data platforms in place being really critical to help, again, speed recovery, because it's optimizing the resources available to where need is. And so there's a few different examples across the country of similar types of online platforms that have been created to really help with this data and resource match. But thinking through, again, from a grant standpoint, or, where you're investing during non-disaster periods, creating these types of systems so that you can respond more quickly and optimize resources is one really important way to think about recovering more quickly from disaster events. And then an example of, what something we do at SBP to think about how to speed recovery is, again, thinking back to financial resources. And so we're working with different states to enable the Recovery Acceleration Fund, which is a social impact investment fund that helps the most vulnerable HUD qualified homeowners to be able to rebuild more quickly after events. We know there's this massive challenge in the US that often, the funds, particularly through HUD, that eventually come available, maybe even 5 or 6 years after a major disaster event, to help qualified survivors. What are you supposed to do in that 5 or 6 year period? And so slowly working through with more states to be able to use a loan fund that SBP with our partner loan institutions give out a loan to qualifying survivors much more quickly after disaster. And then eventually when the HUD funds come in, that loan is reimbursed. But the end goal and outcome is that households, get home and are able to rebuild their homes like 2 years or more sooner. And so, I think these strategies, as we look across the US, are going to become increasingly important. Is how do we create more programs and also non-disaster periods that enable resources to get more quickly to survivors post-disaster. And so working with state entities is really important, even from your local level, of encouraging them to be thinking about what programs and policies would serve folks that are most at need in your areas if something occurs. And so again, quickly went through some different examples here, but would again like to pause and just see if anyone has any questions about, how to absorb and recover from disaster events, or share examples again of how you in your work and communities seek to provide services in these areas.
Esther, I feel like I'm comfortable calling on you, but do you have any thoughts?
Well, we work oftentimes hand in hand with the long-term recovery groups that are established within the communities after the disasters. And so we're coming in a long time after the disasters actually, well, not a long time, but several months after the disasters already occurred. One of the things that we do try to do in preparing them potentially for another disaster is just giving them the resources, some of the ones you've listed here, so that they can be more aware, make sure that they have their information registered, especially if they're homeowners for FEMA, and to make sure they have proper insurance now. We don't necessarily require it, but we provide the information for them to be informed and how to get it and that kind of thing. In addition to just the basics that are important, like having the proper flashlights and kits, survival kits and things like that as well.
Yeah, no, those are great examples, Esther. I think, again, something we really try to do at SBP, because we have a very large FEMA appeals program, is also have, and try to help folks that have gotten federal disaster assistance to understand, if they'd be able to qualify for aid again in the future, depending on if they are, then purchasing insurance for a like event. And it just being important, yeah, to try to guide as many people as possible towards trying or being able to get the financial resources that they need in future by taking important actions like purchasing insurance if they're able. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'm gonna keep going here. And so I think, then the final piece of this puzzle of how we think about building more disaster resilient communities is ultimately what we're trying to do, of course, is build, towards thriving communities. And that is an important goal, but it is, of course, challenging. And so one example of how we're thinking about solving this piece of the puzzle at SBP is through our Resilience Fellows program. So we know that disasters are happening and disproportionately impacting, in particular, low income communities, communities of color. And we know again, and you guys all know many of the challenges on how low capacity communities are struggling to apply for funding and access resources more quickly. And so this program that we're exploring and expanding at SBP is seeking to put fellows for 1 to 2 year periods in at-risk communities where we partner with local government or a major nonprofit in that area to have a fellow embedded, and their major goal being to really put in applications for funding for the projects and activities locally that would be some of the most important starting points, and really basing that again on some of the things that we discussed in this presentation around where does the data show communities are most at risk, what populations need to be more protected. And so, increasing that capacity at the local level to then secure important resources. So therefore communities will be better prepared the next time disaster occurs. And so, that's what we're thinking about during this non-disaster period. But I think there's a lot of different ways communities can think about, increasing capacity, but really trying to, seek out grants during non-disaster periods and get those resources in place is critical. And so I think, again, here it's important to reflect on different questions as you think about what additional activities that you and partners in your communities could take on. But going back over, some of the things we covered here, really, again, being important to understand what your greatest vulnerabilities and risks are in your communities based on what data shows you. Again, also, if you have unfortunately gone through a disaster event recently, what are the lessons learned of what was most challenging, and that helping to inform future planning efforts. Understanding, again, based on the community makeup, what impacts are most important to address. So what does that mean for top priorities of programs and initiatives you're seeking to put in place? And then, of course, we really do need to lower risk because we know disaster risks are increasing across the US. And so really informing priorities around, what projects do the best job of lowering risks and are therefore good long-term investments. And then thinking about, what additional stakeholder groups locally need to be involved in future planning discussions in your area. Are there particular companies and employers that could have a bigger role in helping with community level planning, things that they could be doing with their employees? Is there a local chamber of commerce that could be a good place for housing different types of local initiatives? But really trying to keep up also, I think, the communication across different stakeholder groups and non-disaster periods on what each different stakeholder would be doing and how they'd be supporting one another should something occur is, of course, one of the most critical pieces here. And so with that, I'm sharing our link here to our main resources page on our website. We also have great recovery resources, but really encourage you all to check them out or reach out to us if there's other ones that we also referenced in this presentation that you'd be interested in getting. And then, again, would really appreciate folks filling out our quick survey to help understand what pieces of today's presentation were most helpful. And we will be raffling a gift card to those that fill out our survey. And so with that, and my colleague will put the survey link in the chat, but really want to open it up to additional questions and comments. I'll go back to the former screen though, just so it is also easier for people on the survey front.
I think that oh, sorry, Esther, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think geographically you might be all in different areas. So it'd be interesting to hear from the perspective of like your previous disaster experiences in your geographic areas, if that's something you all might be able to talk about. But Esther, yeah, feel free to jump in.
No, I try to take a break from jumping in. So yeah, I'm definitely from a more rural area in western part of Tennessee, northwestern part of Tennessee. And prior to actually doing the current job I had very little information about preparedness. And so this video I'm kind of looking at both in the perspective of professional, but also in personal, and understanding like how far sometimes we are from the mark of being prepared. And so I really appreciated the training. I learned a lot. I think the biggest part for me was just how you outlined the five parts of the resiliency: the anticipate, prepare, absorb, recover, and thrive. And that can be used in so many different ways. And so with all the resources you've provided, it just gives me a lot to think about. But I think that's been just eye-opening to see there's steps to being prepared, that you can break it down. It's not such a big chunk you have to um, take on all at once. There's steps to help you do that.
Yeah, I think the important thing is, again, because each of us at our own organizations can only take on so much depending on capacity. And so I think it's important, in our own organizations to reflect on, based on our existing capacities and, connections, like where can we make the most substantial steps forward. And so again, yeah, thinking of it as that layering approach of, if your organization focuses most on preparedness activities, what are the additional programs and initiatives there that you could work on in your community, or is there another local organization that more works on the response side and recovery side, and so like how can you pair with them and they kind of take on more initiatives in the kind of recovery end of what they're planning for also during blue skies. Yeah, I think trying to break it down into these different phases is really important.
So team, hey, it's Mike here. So it's kind of coincidental that I've been on these trains for the past 2 days. So my history with SPP actually did a lot of Hurricane Sandy relief work. I'm also helping out the team in Puerto Rico get volunteers to do the home repairs in Puerto Rico. So I've been very active with SPP. But coincidentally, at present time, in real time, as I'm speaking, the Passaic River in northern New Jersey is about to crest. So ironically, my brother-in-law is a teacher, and I've been sharing with him, hey, you may want to talk to your students' parents, right? Because again, they're not looking at a huge issue, but it could be an issue. So, I appreciate these type of trainings because again, it just levels off what we need to do, right? If you were to tell me 20 years ago, as a person who's been living in Jersey all his life, they would have a hurricane, I said, you're crazy. But Mother Nature has other plans. So again, Helen and team, thank you for these presentations because they're very poignant and in real time, it's helping out. So don't think that it's not being used. So thanks again.
Thanks, Mike. And I think you bring up something important about schools and how to better prepare families. Something that's really challenging, when we think about how to get information out to community members is, students and young people, it could be a really good resource. And so I think to me, a goal across this country would be long term is how to have, for instance, in kind of, you know, if a school has any type of like financial class for kids that they need to learn about how to do taxes and all these things for once they're on their own. What are the courses in a high school setting, for instance, where maybe there could be a unit that includes preparing for disaster events. Maybe it's a part of like a health class in high school. I think the challenge, of course, is that there's already so many different things that are asked of our teachers and in curriculums to be delivered. But thinking, at the local level, like, are there ways to utilize schools, for instance, to, have students bring home a packet to work on with their parents of filling out their family preparedness plan. And that being a homework assignment is something that could be really important, particularly again of, risk levels are changing. You're saying, again, like, if a river is going to crest in an area of New Jersey, that could be depending on how it manifests, that could be a really big issue locally. And so, but that's a lot, I think, also at the household level for folks to take on, given how many things are going on. And so that's where, for us as practitioners in this space, thinking through as well of, what are these coordinated networks and strategies we need to have in place for if something occurs, given that, most normal citizens are not thinking about this day to day. So really big challenge and not clear solutions, just lots of layers of activities we need to keep working to build up. Any other questions or comments? I see from Mike also the idea, targeting PTA groups for sharing disaster info. That would be a great idea in communities. I'd love to test that out. Yeah.
I was just gonna say one thing, if you're not opposed to it, I'm gonna steal your phrase of blue skies. I really like that as just simply saying, we're not in the middle of a disaster. We have an opportunity to really actually prepare and not be in crisis and survival mode, because I come from a counseling background, and that's just, I love that phrase. I'm definitely gonna take that. If you're not offended that I'm gonna steal it.
Oh, go for it. No, that's something we use here at SBP is, and yeah, hopefully it makes sense for everyone is, in sunny days where there's no disaster, we're not recovering from something, it's just so important to be doing more and keeping that capacity up of, communicating with all the stakeholders locally, at a minimum. So that, again, we'll be better prepared and coordinated if something happens. But I'm glad you like that phrase. Well, with that, I'll turn it back over to Angela, but please feel free to reach out to us on the Prepare team if there are any ways that we can be a better resource to you all and what you're thinking through in your communities, or if there are additional resources we can point you to. So our email address is listed here on the screen, but thank you all so much for attending today, and I'll turn it back over to Angela.
Thank you so much, Helen. I really appreciate it. And thanks, folks, for joining us. We appreciate you spending your Friday morning with us before the holidays. Yeah, just to bring us back to what I had mentioned earlier, we'll be sending out both recordings from today and yesterday morning, along with the slide decks for both, and resources and survey links that Helen mentioned here earlier. So look for that this afternoon. I'll also be including the Prepare email, which is where you can find Helen and Tessa. And so if you have questions, yeah, please reach out. We're here. We're happy to help. And even to just have a conversation about what you guys are doing and how we might be able to recommend some things. So anyway, with that, have a great holiday season. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you guys in 2024.